The dust hung thick in the saloon that evening, swirling through the lamplight like ghosts searching for rest they'd never find. Sarah McGlintock stood behind the bar, her calloused hands gripping the edge of the polished wood so hard her knuckles went white. She'd said those words 100 times in her mind, practiced them until they should have come out smooth as whiskey. But when Tom Garrett walked through those swinging doors with that confident stride of his, all she could manage was a whisper that got lost in the piano music. Tom Garrett owned the biggest ranch in 3 counties, a sprawling empire of cattle and grassland that stretched from the mesa to the river valley. He was a man who took what he wanted, and right now, what he wanted was standing right in front of him, pretending to wipe down glasses that were already clean. Sarah had worked at the Silver Dollar Saloon for 2 years, ever since her father's farm went under and she'd needed to support her younger sister. She was 23 years old, with honey-colored hair she kept pinned up and eyes that shifted between green and gray depending on the light. She was beautiful in that quiet, understated way that made men look twice, but she carried herself with a dignity that usually kept the rougher elements at bay. Usually. "Evening, Sarah," Tom said, leaning against the bar with that easy smile that had charmed half the women in the territory. He was 42, handsome in a weathered sort of way, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that came from squinting at horizons. "Whiskey neat." Sarah poured without meeting his eyes, her hand steady despite the trembling in her chest. She'd been avoiding this moment for weeks now, ever since Tom had started coming in more regularly, ever since his attention had shifted from casual friendliness to something more pointed, more dangerous. She'd heard the stories about Tom Garrett. Everyone had. He had a wife back east who never visited, a marriage that existed on paper but nowhere else. He had appetites, they said, and a way of satisfying them that left broken hearts and ruined reputations scattered across the county like tumbleweeds. "You're looking particularly lovely tonight," Tom said, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the noise of the crowded saloon. His fingers brushed hers as he took the glass, and Sarah pulled her hand back like she'd touched a hot stove. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett," she said, her voice carefully neutral. She turned to serve another customer, grateful for the interruption, but she could feel his eyes on her, patient and predatory. The night wore on, and Tom didn't leave. He nursed his whiskey, played a few hands of poker with the local ranchers, laughed at their jokes, but his attention kept circling back to Sarah like a hawk eyeing a rabbit. When the clock struck 11 and the crowd began to thin, Sarah felt her anxiety spike. Her boss, old Pete, had already headed upstairs to his room, leaving her to close up. Usually, she liked this quiet time, the ritual of washing glasses and sweeping floors, but tonight the emptiness felt threatening. "Don't do that. Please," Sarah finally said when Tom approached the bar again, his intentions clear in the way he looked at her. The words came out stronger this time, firm despite the fear racing through her veins. "I'm not that kind of girl, Mr. Garrett. I respect myself, and I'd appreciate it if you'd respect me too." Tom's smile didn't falter, but something shifted in his eyes, a flash of something darker beneath the charm. "I respect you plenty, Sarah. That's why I'm being a gentleman about this. I could offer you things, you know, security, a proper house for you and that sister of yours. No more working in saloons, no more scraping by." "I'd rather scrape by with my dignity intact," Sarah said, her chin lifting despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd seen this play out before with other girls in other towns. The promises that sounded sweet as honey but turned bitter as wormwood. The life of a kept woman, dependent on a man's whims, discarded when he grew bored or when his legal wife decided to finally pay attention. Tom's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Sarah. I'm not a man who asks twice." "Then I guess you won't be asking again," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, but her resolve iron strong. For a long moment, they stood there in the lamplight, the air between them crackling with unspoken threats and unacknowledged fear. Then Tom straightened, adjusted his hat, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back, his face half in shadow. "We'll see about that," he said, and then he was gone, leaving Sarah alone with her racing heart and the terrible certainty that this wasn't over. She finished closing the saloon with shaking hands, checking the locks twice before climbing the narrow stairs to the small room she shared with her sister Emma. The 15-year-old was already asleep, her face peaceful in the moonlight streaming through the window. Sarah stood there for a long moment, watching her sister breathe, thinking about the promises Tom had made and the threats he'd implied. She thought about their precarious position in this rough frontier town, about how vulnerable they really were, two women alone with no family and no protection beyond what Sarah could provide with her own wits and will. She undressed quietly and slipped into bed beside Emma, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and replayed the conversation, wondering if she'd made the right choice, knowing deep in her bones that she had but terrified of what the cost might be. Tom Garrett was a powerful man, and powerful men in the Wild West didn't take rejection well. They found ways to get what they wanted, or they found ways to make you regret denying them. Sarah didn't know it then, but her instincts were right. The real trouble was just beginning, and by the time it was over, lives would be changed forever in ways no one could have predicted. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare, each day bringing new pressure, new complications. Tom Garrett didn't come back to the Silver Dollar himself, but his presence was felt everywhere Sarah turned. First, there was the reduction in her hours. Old Pete called her into his office, his weathered face apologetic but firm. Tom owned the building the saloon operated in, Pete explained, and he'd suggested that maybe Sarah wasn't working out so well. Maybe she needed less responsibility. Sarah understood immediately. This was how it would work. Tom would squeeze, slowly and carefully, until she had no choice but to come to him asking for help. It was a strategy as old as power itself, and devastatingly effective. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Pete said, and she could see he genuinely was. "I got no choice in this. He's my landlord. But I can still give you 3 nights a week instead of 6. 3 nights meant half the money. Half the money meant Sarah and Emma would be eating thin soup and day-old bread. Meant the rent on their room would be constantly overdue, meant new shoes for Emma would be an impossible luxury." Sarah thanked Pete and walked out with her head high, but inside she was calculating, scrambling, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work. She found work where she could, taking in mending and washing, helping at the general store when they needed an extra pair of hands. It was back-breaking labor that paid pennies, and every night Sarah fell into bed exhausted, her fingers raw from scrubbing and sewing. Emma noticed, of course. The girl wasn't stupid, and she'd grown up fast after their father died. "What's happening, Sarah?" Emma asked one evening as they sat in their small room, Sarah squinting in the candlelight as she repaired a torn shirt for Mrs. Henderson. "Why aren't you working at the saloon as much?" Sarah considered lying, protecting her sister from the ugly truth, but Emma deserved better than that. "There's a man who's taken an interest in me," she said carefully. "A powerful man. I turned him down, and now he's making things difficult." Emma's face went pale. At 15, she understood what that meant. Understood the dangers that women faced on the frontier when men with power decided they wanted something. "Tom Garrett," she said, and it wasn't a question. Sarah looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" "People talk," Emma said quietly. "I hear things at the market. They say he always gets what he wants, one way or another." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They say terrible things about what happens to the girls who refuse him. Well, I'm refusing him," Sarah said firmly, "and whatever happens, we'll face it together. I won't compromise myself, Emma. I won't teach you that dignity has a price." But dignity didn't pay the rent, and 2 weeks later, Mrs. Morrison, who owned their boarding house, knocked on their door with regret in her eyes and a notice in her hand. They had 1 week to settle their account or find new accommodations. The amount owed wasn't huge by most standards, but for Sarah and Emma, It might as well have been a mountain. That same day, Sarah saw Tom Garrett riding through town, and he tipped his hat to her with a knowing smile that made her skin crawl. He knew. Of course he knew. Probably he'd orchestrated the whole thing. A word here, a payment there, greasing the wheels that would grind Sarah down to desperation. She didn't sleep that night, pacing their small room while Emma pretended to sleep, both of them pretending the other didn't know they were crying. By morning, Sarah had made a decision. She would go to the bank, see if they'd give her a small loan against future wages. It was a long shot, but she had to try. The banker, Mr. Jameson, listened to her request with increasing discomfort. He was a kind man, a family man, and Sarah could see he wanted to help. But when she finished her pitch, he shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry, Miss McGlintock. The bank has certain policies about lending to unmarried women without collateral. And even if we didn't, I have to be honest with you." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Tom Garrett is a major depositor here. He's made it clear that any business dealings with you would be viewed unfavorably. I have a family to feed, Sarah. I can't afford to cross him." Sarah left the bank feeling hollowed out, scraped clean of hope. Everywhere she turned, Tom's influence preceded her, closing doors, cutting off options. She thought about leaving town entirely, just taking Emma and heading to California or Oregon, starting fresh somewhere Tom Garrett's name meant nothing. But they didn't have money for train fare, barely had money for their next meal. That evening, as Sarah served drinks at the Silver Dollar during one of her reduced shifts, a well-dressed woman entered the saloon. It was unusual, a woman of obvious quality in a place like this, and the room went quiet. The woman approached Sarah directly, her silk skirts rustling, her face beautiful but hard in the way of someone who'd learned difficult lessons. "Miss McGlintock," the woman said, "my name is Victoria Winters. I wonder if we might speak privately." They stepped out back into the alley, where Victoria lit a cigarette with steady hands and studied Sarah with calculating eyes. "I know what Tom Garrett is doing to you," she said without preamble. "I know because he did the same thing to me 5 years ago. I ran a dress shop on Main Street, had a good business, a good reputation. He wanted me. I refused him, and within 3 months I was ruined, lost everything." Sarah's heart sank. "Then why are you here? To warn me it's hopeless." "No," Victoria said, blowing smoke into the darkening sky. "I'm here to tell you that Tom Garrett has a weakness, and if you're brave enough, you can use it against him. But it requires something from you, something difficult. You'll have to pretend to give in." The plan Victoria outlined was risky, perhaps insane, but it was the only lifeline Sarah had been offered. Victoria explained that she'd spent the past 5 years carefully studying Tom Garrett, learning his patterns, his weaknesses, the skeletons he kept locked in closets. She'd been waiting for the right moment, the right person to help her expose him for what he really was. "He's not just a rancher with a wandering eye," Victoria said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "He's been stealing water rights from smaller ranchers, forging documents, driving people off their land through intimidation and fraud. I have evidence, documents I've collected over the years, but I need more. I need proof of his current activities, something that would stand up if brought to the territorial authorities. And you think I can get that?" Sarah asked, her mind racing through the implications. "I think if you pretend to accept his offer, if you make him believe you've been broken down and are willing to be his mistress, he'll let his guard down around you. Men like Tom think women are either conquests or obstacles. Once he believes he's conquered you, he'll stop being careful. That's when you can search his ranch office, find the documents we need." Sarah felt sick at the thought, but she forced herself to consider it rationally. "And if he expects, if he wants, you'll have to string him along," Victoria said bluntly. "Make excuses, delay. Play the innocent who needs time to adjust to the arrangement. He likes the chase as much as the capture. You can probably buy yourself a few weeks before he gets impatient. It took Sarah 3 days to make her decision. 3 days of watching Emma go hungry, of seeing their few possessions packed up as eviction loomed. Finally, she sent a message to Tom Garrett through one of his ranch hands, a simple note that said she'd reconsidered his offer and would like to speak with him. Tom arrived at the boarding house the next evening, driving a fine carriage, dressed in his best suit. He looked triumphant, and why wouldn't he? He'd won, or so he thought. Sarah came down the stairs slowly, wearing her best dress, her hair arranged carefully. She'd practiced her expression in the mirror, aiming for defeated but still dignified, a woman making the best of bad circumstances. "Mr. Garrett," she said softly. "Thank you for coming." "I knew you'd come around, Sarah," Tom said, and the satisfaction in his voice made her want to slap him. "You're a smart girl." Too smart to throw away a good opportunity over foolish pride. She let him hand her into the carriage. Let him drive her out to his ranch as the sun set over the mesa, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. The ranch house was impressive, a sprawling structure of adobe and wood that spoke of wealth and power. Tom showed her around like a king displaying his domain, pointing out improvements he'd made, expansion he was planning. "You and your sister could live here," he said. "Emma could have a proper education, maybe even go back east to a finishing school. You'd never want for anything, Sarah." Sarah forced herself to smile, to play the role. "It's more generous than I deserve," she said, the words like ash in her mouth. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah visited the ranch regularly, always chaperoned, always careful to maintain a certain distance while appearing to warm to Tom's attention. She brought Emma once, wanting her sister to see the layout of the place, to know where the exits were in case things went wrong. Emma played her own part perfectly, exclaiming over the house, the horses, the luxury that surrounded them. But in private, the sisters spoke in whispers about what they were really doing. Victoria met with them in secret, providing instructions, explaining what documents to look for. The key was Tom's office, a locked room where he conducted his business. Victoria had learned from a former ranch hand that Tom kept a ledger there, a detailed record of his land acquisitions and the methods he'd used to obtain them. "The lock is a simple pin tumbler," Victoria explained, showing Sarah a basic lockpick she'd acquired. "I've been practicing with one just like it. It's not difficult if you stay calm." Sarah learned to pick locks in the cramped boarding house room, her fingers clumsy at first but gradually gaining skill. Emma kept watch, reading a book by the window, ready to signal if anyone approached. It felt surreal, these two respectable young women planning what amounted to a theft, but Sarah kept reminding herself what was at stake. Not just their own futures, but justice for all the people Tom had crushed on his way to building his empire. The opportunity came 3 weeks into the charade, during a dinner party Tom hosted for some visiting cattle buyers from Denver. He'd insisted Sarah attend, wanting to show her off, and she'd agreed, knowing the evening would provide the distraction she needed. The house was full of people, servants rushing back and forth, attention focused on the dining room and parlor. Sarah excused herself, claiming a headache, and instead of going to the guest room Tom had indicated, she made her way to his office. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might bruise her ribs, but her hands were steady as she knelt before the lock, inserting the picks Victoria had given her. It took 3 agonizing minutes, each second feeling like an hour, but finally the lock clicked open. Sarah slipped inside, closing the door behind her. The office was exactly as Victoria had described it, a large mahogany desk, filing cabinets, bookshelves lined with ledgers. She lit a small lamp, keeping the flame low, and began her search. The ledger was in the second drawer she tried, a leather-bound volume filled with Tom's precise handwriting. Sarah's breath caught as she read the entries. Victoria had been right. Here was documentation of bribes paid to county officials, of threats made to families who wouldn't sell their land, of water rights diverted illegally, of partnerships with corrupt lawyers and judges. She was so absorbed in reading that she almost didn't hear the footsteps in the hall outside. Almost. Sarah froze, her mind racing. She couldn't be caught here, not with the evidence literally in her hands. She looked around desperately, but the room had only one door and one window, and the window was nailed shut. The footsteps grew closer, and she recognized Tom's distinctive tread, his confident stride. In a moment of pure instinct, Sarah shoved the ledger into the front of her dress, extinguished the lamp, and pressed herself against the wall beside the door just as it opened. Tom entered the office carrying his own lamp, humming softly to himself, clearly planning to retrieve something before returning to his guests. Sarah held her breath, pressed flat against the wall in the shadows, praying he wouldn't turn, wouldn't see her. The ledger pressed against her chest felt enormous, impossible to hide, but she didn't dare move. Tom went to a cabinet, pulled out a bottle of expensive brandy and 2 glasses, then turned to leave. For one terrible moment, his lamplight swept across the space where Sarah stood, and she was certain he'd seen her. But his mind was on his guests, on the business deals he was negotiating, and he walked out without noticing the terrified young woman frozen in the darkness. Sarah waited a full minute after his footsteps faded before she moved, her legs trembling so badly she nearly fell. She slipped out of the office, locked it behind her, and made her way to the guest room with the ledger still hidden against her body. She needed to get out of the house, but she couldn't leave too quickly without raising suspicion. She forced herself to return to the party, making apologies for her absence, allowing Tom to fuss over her supposed headache. She endured another hour of polite conversation and false smiles before finally claiming exhaustion and asking if Tom's driver could take her back to town. Tom, playing the concerned gentleman for his guests, readily agreed. The carriage ride felt endless, every bump in the road making Sarah fear the ledger would slip, that the driver would somehow know what she was carrying. But finally, they arrived at the boarding house, and Sarah climbed down with murmured thanks, clutching her shawl around her to keep the ledger secure. Emma was waiting in their room, her face pale with anxiety. When Sarah showed her what she'd taken, the girl's eyes went wide. "You did it," Emma breathed. "You actually did it." "We're only halfway there," Sarah said, but she allowed herself a moment of relief, of hope. "We need to get this to Victoria tonight." They slipped out through the boarding house's back entrance and made their way through the dark streets to Victoria's small house on the edge of town. Victoria opened the door before they could knock, as if she'd been watching for them. "Did you find it?" she asked urgently. Sarah handed over the ledger without a word. Victoria took it to her kitchen table, lighting every lamp in the house, and began to read. As the minutes passed, her expression shifted from hope to fierce satisfaction to something darker, angrier. "This is it," she finally said, her voice shaking. "This is everything we need. These entries detail every illegal land acquisition, every bribe, every threat. With this and the documents I've already collected, we can take him down." "How?" Sarah asked. "Who do we give it to?" "You said yourself he's paid off half the officials in the county." "Not all of them," Victoria said. "There's a territorial judge, Marcus Sullivan, who's known for being incorruptible. He's in Santa Fe right now, but he'll be coming through here in 2 weeks for the circuit court. If we can get this evidence to him, Tom Garrett will face justice. 2 weeks. Sarah felt her hope dim slightly. Tom will notice the ledger is missing. He'll know someone took it. Probably, Victoria agreed. Which means the next 2 weeks are going to be very dangerous. He'll suspect you first, since you're the one who's been in his house. You and Emma need to stay out of sight as much as possible. But staying out of sight proved impossible. The next morning, Tom's foreman appeared at the boarding house, demanding to see Sarah. She met him in the parlor, her face carefully neutral despite her racing heart. "Mr. Garrett wants to see you at the ranch," the foreman said. His name was Dutch Mackenzie, and he had the look of a man who'd done things he wasn't proud of. "Right away. I'm afraid I'm not feeling well," Sarah said. "Perhaps in a few days." "He said now, miss. And he said to tell you he knows you were in his office last night. Said there's something missing, and he'd like to discuss it." Sarah's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression composed. "I don't know what he's talking about. I was at dinner, then I rested in the guest room because of my headache, then I came home. I didn't go into any office." Dutch studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the distinct impression he didn't believe her, but also that he didn't particularly care. "Just delivering the message, miss. Mr. Garrett expects you this afternoon. I'll be back with the carriage at 2 o'clock. After he left, Sarah immediately sent Emma to Victoria's house with a message explaining what had happened. Victoria's response came back within an hour. "Deny everything. He has no proof. Don't go to the ranch alone. I'll come with you." At 2 o'clock, when Dutch arrived with the carriage, Victoria was waiting with Sarah. Dutch looked surprised but didn't object when both women climbed aboard. The ride to the ranch was tense and silent, the beautiful landscape rolling past unnoticed as Sarah prepared herself for the confrontation ahead. Tom was waiting in the parlor, his usual charm completely absent. His face was hard, his eyes cold in a way Sarah had never seen before. When he saw Victoria, his expression darkened further. "I didn't invite you, Mrs. Winters," he said icily. "Miss McGlintock is a respectable young lady," Victoria replied with equal coldness. "She requires a chaperone when visiting a man of your reputation." The insult hung in the air between them. Tom's jaw clenched, but he turned his attention to Sarah. "Something was taken from my office last night, a ledger. Very important. Very private. You were the only guest who left the party, the only person who could have accessed that room." Sarah met his eyes steadily, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. "I don't know anything about a ledger, Mr. Garrett. I told your foreman the truth. I was at dinner, then I rested because of my headache. I never went near your office." "You're lying," Tom said flatly. "And I want that ledger back. Now." "She doesn't have it," Victoria interjected. "And even if she did, what would be in this ledger that's so important? What are you so afraid of people seeing, Tom?" The rage that crossed Tom's face was terrifying. For a moment, Sarah thought he might actually strike them. But he controlled himself with visible effort, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "You've made a very serious mistake," he said quietly, and the soft tone was somehow more menacing than if he'd shouted. "Both of you. This isn't over." The 2 weeks that followed were the longest of Sarah's life. Tom made good on his threat, turning his considerable resources toward making their lives miserable. Sarah lost her job at the Silver Dollar entirely when old Pete received an eviction notice for the saloon. Emma was harassed on the street by men who worked for Tom, nothing overtly threatening but enough to frighten her. Shopkeepers who'd been friendly suddenly refused them service. But Victoria had been preparing for this fight for 5 years, and she had resources of her own. She'd quietly built alliances with other people Tom had wronged, small ranchers he'd cheated, business owners he'd run out of town. When Sarah and Emma were evicted from their boarding house, they found refuge with a farmer named Jacob Miller, whose water rights Tom had stolen. Jacob's wife, Helen, welcomed them with quiet determination, her own desire for justice burning as bright as theirs. More than that, Victoria had been making copies of the ledger, working through the nights with Sarah and Emma's help, carefully transcribing every damning entry. She sent these copies to trusted contacts in Santa Fe, in Denver, in places beyond Tom Garrett's reach. Insurance, she called it, in case anything happened to the original. Judge Marcus Sullivan arrived in town on a Tuesday morning, riding in with his court clerk and a small security detail. Victoria had sent him a message days earlier, asking for a private meeting, explaining in vague terms that she had evidence of serious crimes committed by a prominent local citizen. The judge, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, agreed to meet that evening. Sarah, Victoria, and Emma arrived at the judge's hotel under cover of darkness. carrying the ledger and Victoria's meticulously organized files of supporting documentation. They'd expected the meeting to be brief, a simple handover of evidence, but Judge Sullivan had other ideas. "These are serious allegations," he said after examining the ledger for over an hour, his clerk taking notes beside him. "If even half of what's documented here is true, Mr. Garrett has committed fraud, extortion, theft, and conspiracy. But I need to verify this independently. I need witnesses willing to testify." "We have witnesses," Victoria said. She'd been preparing for this moment, building her case piece by piece. Over the next hour, she laid out a network of people willing to speak against Tom Garrett. Dozens of victims who'd been waiting years for someone to listen. Judge Sullivan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Very well. I'll issue a warrant for Mr. Garrett's arrest tomorrow morning, and we'll begin preliminary hearings. I'll need all of you to testify. Are you prepared for that? Mr. Garrett will fight back hard." "We're prepared," Sarah said, and she was. The fear was still there, but it was tempered now with something stronger: determination and the knowledge that she wasn't alone. The next morning, when the federal marshal serving Judge Sullivan tried to arrest Tom Garrett at his ranch, Tom attempted to flee. It was a desperate move, one that only made him look more guilty. The marshal and his deputies chased him across open country for 3 hours before finally cornering him in a canyon. Tom surrendered, his face a mask of impotent rage, and was brought back to town in chains. The trial lasted 2 weeks and became the talk of the entire territory. Newspapers sent reporters. People came from neighboring counties to watch the proceedings. Sarah testified for 3 days, walking the judge and jury through her experiences, explaining how she'd come to take the ledger, how Tom had tried to ruin her for refusing his advances. Emma testified about the harassment they'd faced. Jacob Miller and a dozen other ranchers testified about stolen water rights and forged documents. But it was Victoria's testimony that sealed Tom's fate. She took the stand and with devastating precision walked through 5 years of research, 5 years of carefully documented crimes. She spoke about her own experience with Tom, how he'd destroyed her business and her reputation, how she'd vowed to bring him to justice. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Tom Garrett was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison, his assets seized to compensate his victims. His ranch, that symbol of ill-gotten power, was broken up and sold, the proceeds distributed among the people he'd cheated. Sarah and Emma received enough money to buy a small house in town and start a dressmaking business with Victoria as their partner. 6 months after the trial, Sarah stood in the doorway of their new shop, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Emma was inside, already at work on a wedding dress for the banker's daughter. Victoria was due to arrive soon with fabric samples from Santa Fe. It was a quiet life, a simple life, but it was theirs, built on their own terms. A young rancher named Daniel Cooper had been courting Sarah, a genuinely kind man who testified against Tom during the trial. He was patient, respectful, willing to wait until Sarah was ready to trust again. Yesterday, he'd asked if he could call on her Sunday afternoon, maybe take her for a ride to see the wildflowers blooming in the foothills. Sarah had said yes. She thought about the moment that had started all of this, when she'd stood behind the bar at the Silver Dollar and whispered those words, "Don't do that. Please." She'd been terrified then, powerless, alone. But she'd stood her ground, and in standing, she'd found her strength. The experience of fighting Tom Garrett had changed her in ways both subtle and profound. She understood now that justice wasn't something handed down from above. It was something ordinary people had to fight for, sometimes at great personal cost. She understood that dignity couldn't be bought or sold, only defended. And she understood that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined, capable of courage she hadn't known she possessed. Emma emerged from the shop, wiping her hands on her apron, her face bright with youth and hope. At 17, she was blooming into a beautiful young woman, confident in ways Sarah had never been at that age. She'd learned from her sister's example that women didn't have to accept the world as men made it, that they could fight back, could change things. "Sarah," Emma called, "Mrs. Henderson is here for her fitting. Are you coming?" Sarah took one last look at the sunrise, at the town that had almost broken her, but had instead forged her into someone new, someone better. Then she turned and went inside, ready to work, ready to build, ready to live the life she'd fought so hard to claim. Tom Garrett rotted in prison, but Sarah McGlintock and her sister thrived. They built their business, served their community, and held their heads high. When people asked Sarah about those dark weeks when Tom had tried to destroy her, she always said the same thing. "He thought breaking me down would make me bend. Instead, it taught me how to fight." Years later, when Sarah married Daniel Cooper in a ceremony attended by half the town, Victoria was her maid of honor. Emma read a poem she'd written for the occasion, something about strength and dignity and the bonds between women who'd faced darkness together and emerged into light. The story of Sarah McGlintock and Tom Garrett became legend in that part of the territory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and a hopeful one about the strength of ordinary people standing together against corruption. Mothers told it to their daughters as a lesson in standing firm. Young women facing their own struggles found courage in Sarah's example. And Sarah herself, now Sarah Cooper, mother of 3, business owner, respected member of her community, never forgot those words she'd said in the Silver Dollar Saloon. "Don't do that, please." They'd been a plea then, a desperate request for respect from a man who had none to give. But they'd become something more, a declaration of independence. The first words of a story about a woman who refused to be broken, who stood up to power, and who lived to build a life of her own choosing. Tom Garrett had wanted to make her his conquest, his possession. Instead, she'd become his downfall. And in the end, that made all the difference.